Okay, so we're live and recording. So we're here today with Carlos Castro-Gonzalez of, oh man, I'm sorry, of Leuko. Can you give us a background of Leuko and the company and how you guys founded it?
Sure. So Leuko is a company that actually spun out from MIT. That's where the team of co-founders initially met. It's a team of 4 co-founders. It's me with Butterworth, Aurelien Bourquard, and Alvaro Sanchez-Ferro. We met when we were postdocs at MIT, as I was saying. We were part of a program that was focused on finding unmet medical needs or important clinical problems that don't have a solution today, and then design technical solutions that would be uniquely positioned to solve those problems. So the problem that we identified initially was related to cancer patients undergoing chemotherapy. And one of the major side effects for them is that their white blood cells drop to very low and dangerous levels, and that exposes them to frequent and life-threatening infections. At the time, that's actually something that I had like personal experience with, because one of my best friends from Madrid, he was undergoing chemotherapy at the time I joined the program. So I guess that I was especially sensitive to that problem. And I could experience firsthand how worried he was about his white blood cell levels. So that was a personal motivation for me to actually start working on this particular problem. And I'm glad to report that, by the way, my friend, he went successfully through chemo, so he's cancer-free. So that was great news.
That's good to hear. Can you elaborate a little bit on how they go about monitoring the white blood cells and how difficult is that? And then that will lead us ultimately into your product.
Yeah, so one of the actually limitations and one of the reasons why this problem happens is that the current method to monitor the white blood cells for these patients, they all require a blood draw. So patients must go into the clinic to get a blood sample, and that obviously limits how frequently this test can be performed. You cannot be bringing the patients back to the clinic every day. I mean, especially in today's context. So that means that in between chemotherapy cycles, when the patients are actually at home, their white blood cells may or may not be dropping. There is no knowledge currently. And if they do, the physicians are actually in the dark, and they don't know which patients are actually at risk of these life-threatening infections. So what we set out to develop was a method that wouldn't require blood sampling whatsoever, a completely non-invasive method that would enable for the first time for patients to do this test from home and much more frequently, so that those that are in trouble can be detected earlier and preventive treatment can be deployed to those who need it.
And then also, if their white blood cell count has dropped, then they're compromised, so they don't actually want to be in the clinic environment any more than they have to, correct?
Absolutely. So that's another great reason actually to keep patients away from the hospitals, particularly in those situations when they are compromised. As I was saying, this is even more obvious today because of COVID. So we think that actually our solution fits very well in this context.
Okay. And then how did so you identified this problem from a use case where you actually knew a person who had this pain point. So how did you go about building a solution for this?
As I was saying, we look at ways to do it non-invasively. So we thought of a product that would involve microscopy. So our product is basically a portable microscope that looks through the skin of the finger, particularly in an area that is well known to have very superficial capillaries. These capillaries are very narrow blood vessels. And by taking videos through the skin, we can actually see the blood flowing through these very narrow vessels, and they are so thin that the white blood cells must squeeze through them one by one. We are using then one particular wavelength that is absorbed by the red cells, but white cells are transparent to it, so we can actually see them as bright spots passing through these capillaries in our videos that we can then analyze with AI algorithms to get a measurement.
And how accurate is that diagnostic?
Yeah, so we performed a clinical study with our first prototype, where we tested our prototype on 40 chemotherapy patients in 2 hospitals in Boston and Madrid. And we compared the results of our test with the gold standard blood sample that they were getting at the hospital. And we demonstrated that we can identify with high specificity and sensitivity those patients that are at those low values. Our first product, our minimum viable product, is not replacing the blood draws, and it's just providing a kind of a warning So it's able to give a binary reading, if you will, about whether patients are critically immunocompromised or not. So that's, and we showed that we were very accurate at making that binary classification.
And so does the patient with this device have the ability to, like, will it give them a warning? Will it give them a reading and they have to understand what the reading is? Or will it send a notice to the primary care? How does that work? How did they get their results and what do they do with it?
Yeah, so well, patients would use the device from home every day. They just simply have to insert the finger in the device for 1 minute for the measurement to be performed, and then the results of the test are sent back. This is a connected device, so those are sent back to the care team that follows up with the patient in case there are any problems. We interviewed actually more than 50 key opinion leaders in oncology just to make sure of what actions they would do if they had this information. So they told us that if only they knew which patients are critically immunocompromised, they could follow up with either prophylactic antibiotics or growth colony stimulating factors. These are drugs that boost the creation of white cells, and that could actually reduce the number of hospital readmissions for these patients by 50%.
So the patient, as a result of the test, doesn't directly know the outcome. They'll know based on whether or not they get a response from the office saying, "Hey, come on in," right?
That's a great question, and actually that's a question that we have been discussing with the FDA. We recently met with them to discuss the protocol for approval of our product, and this was the same question that you are asking that was raised by the FDA. Particularly, we initially were thinking of having the patients know the results of the test, but the FDA was worried a little bit about the consequences that they may have. I mean, that may provide like extra worry to the patients. So they actually were favoring a solution where the result of the test is provided only to the care team, and then the care team does follow up with the patient in case there is anything wrong. The patient would get a notification notifying him or her that they have performed the test successfully. And there are actually some other home monitoring solutions in the market today that work this way. There is a product in the market for diabetics to monitor diabetic patients from home that follows the same procedure. Patients are only notified that they completed the measurement successfully, but then it is the care team that receives the results of the test. So we are following the same strategy here.
Yeah, that's really interesting, right? Because there's such a push on transparency, and yet there isn't, right? You know what I mean? Like, so the idea is like, oh, well, they can't have access to direct medical information without the specialist there, guiding them as to what they should do next. And then, so I guess it depends on the turnaround time of the team, the care team, as to how long the person is wondering how they're doing, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there is an extra benefit to our device that it reminds the patient to follow what is called neutropenic precautions. So when the patients are critically immunocompromised, they are typically warned or I guess advised to stay at home and avoid contacts with others. So these are some of the reminders that our device would send to patients. So from that sense, we would be reinforcing the standard of care. And even without the intervention of the care team, obviously they would follow up if there is any problem, and that's where you get the benefit in terms of reduced hospital readmissions. But I guess that is also worth keeping in mind that our product is quite innovative. This is the first time that something like this is being done. So obviously the FDA's first concern is patient safety, and they don't want to create like extra worry or complications for them, and they want to make sure that this always is channeled through the professionals. So we are following FDA's guidance on this point.
Sure. And then is this a daily test or every couple of hours? How often would they perform this?
Yeah. So the vision is for patients to do this daily. There is a previous data from studies that shows that kind of doing daily measurements is the sweet spot or the optimal frequency for testing in order to catch when patients drop. So that's what we are intending to do.
And I'm assuming the intent here is that combined with the AI, you will have, earlier, indicators that something is changing or that the blood cells are dropping, and therefore you have the opportunity for the care team to intervene. Is that correct?
That's exactly correct. As I was saying, just to give an example, in the US, 650,000 patients start chemotherapy regimens every year. and 110,000, which is 1 in 5 or 1 in 6 of them end up hospitalized because they have an infection while their white blood cells are critically low. Each of these hospital readmissions obviously has really negative clinical outcomes on those patients, but also comes at a cost of $25,000 per hospital readmission. So if you do the math, the US healthcare system is spending $3 billion annually on this problem alone. And if we catch those patients early and follow up with either antibiotics or growth factors, those numbers could be reduced by 50%. So this is a really huge problem and a critical unmet need.
And, you know, I'm assuming that there's other means other than the blood draw to sort of determine something's going on. How much earlier does this device combined with AI sort of, you know, give the patient a heads up versus other traditional means?
Yeah, so I guess the traditional mean currently to detect if something's going wrong with the patients is actually the thermometer. These patients are instructed to take their temperature on a daily basis or frequently. And if they have a temperature, obviously that indicates a fever and an infection. But by then they already have the infection, so it's already too late. At that point they need to report to the emergency room, and that's where the cost and the negative clinical outcomes comes. So if you will, what we are developing is a better thermometer or a predictive thermometer, a tool that can tell when patients are very likely to develop an infection, but before they actually develop it. And we, based on the previous data that was published, we could detect that in with 3 or 4 days in anticipation. So that gives us a window to deploy those preventive treatments.
And as you were developing this product, you were supported by the NIH, correct?
That's correct.
All right, and can you tell us a little bit about how that support and the SBIR program helped you, and you know how it changed outcomes for you?
Yeah, so the NIH is the National Institute of Health in the US. They have this program called SBIR that stands for Small Business and Innovation Research, where the NIH wants to support innovative startups that are making products that can contribute to Americans' healthcare. So we were really fortunate to have the support of one of these awards, which are really competitive. So that was really exciting for the whole team. And we recently got notified that we got a phase 2 SBIR award. So that means that that will be bringing $2 million in non-dilutive funding for our company. And that's going to support our product development and our clinical trials for FDA regulation, so that we can start actually putting this product on the market. So having the support of NIH behind us is really important for this company, and we are really fortunate and excited to go ahead on the next steps on this project.
And I understand. I mean, the money is great, right? So no one's complaining about that. But what other things? Like, do you have a mentor? Do you have access to advisors? You know, what else does the program bring? Like I said, I'm not complaining about the money, but you know, there's more to it, right? So sort of tell me a little bit about that as well.
Well, it brings a whole lot of credibility because obviously, as I was saying, these grants and these awards are very competitive. So there are many companies applying for them, and they have a very rigorous review process where you have scientific experts and clinical doctors reviewing your application for the significance of your problem, the feasibility of your solution, and many other criteria. So the fact that we got it awarded, this came after a very thorough peer review. So that's obviously extra credibility for our company. So that's one side benefit. Apart from that, there are many other ways that they support apart from the dollar amount. We recently were enrolled in a program that is offered to SBIR companies that is called Innovation Corps, where NIH connects you to industry mentors, and you go through a customer discovery process of 2 months where you set out to make at least 100 customer interviews. They want to make sure that once you get their support, there is going to be a good product market fit. So they encourage to get out there and interview at least 100 of your customers. I guess that in every startup, early stage startup, you have a business plan and you have some hypotheses or assumptions about who you are going to be selling to. So you have, in our case, we had our business plan was based on doing sales to private cancer clinics and insurance companies, for instance. So we set out to interview 100 of those customers. And that was a really great exercise to get a good feel of what are your customer needs and how to do the whole process of how a sale is performed for each of these customers, what is the lead time. We were able to develop a few relationships with a few key customers. And all of this process was supported by and guided by NIH and by NIH mentors. So that was just to give an example of another side benefit.
And then you are pursuing this both in the United States as well as in Europe, correct? So product certification, market entry. So, compare and contrast, right? So what's it like trying to, do this in the US versus Europe, and what are the benefits of the US and what are the benefits of Europe?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that you bring up this question because actually our company is half American and half European. We have an office in Madrid and an office in Boston. Half of our team is in Madrid, half of our team is in Boston. So we are really looking at both.
So that explains your Boston accent, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I've been living here for 7 years, but I thought that, the accent would go away, but it's proven to be resilient.
Yeah, you're never losing those Madrid Ds ever. So compare and contrast. Tell me a little bit about the experience in the U.S. compared to what your experiences in Europe are like.
Yeah, I mean the U.S. market has I guess has a lot of advantages. It's obviously a really huge market, probably one of the biggest markets in the world for healthcare. It has the advantage that you have like the access to 350 million consumers, and it's very easy to scale. Once you start like selling to one hospital system in the US or one state, it's relatively easy to expand geographically and access all this market. The European Union, even though it's a common market, every country has their own like regulations, and it's a little bit more difficult to scale.
And language, right?
The language is, I guess, one of that barriers, kind of preventing that scale process. So you have to do it kind of almost on a country-by-country basis. That being said, the US healthcare system has its own peculiarities. It's based on private insurers, and most of the market is based on what is called fee-for-service. So basically, you do a procedure and you get a reimbursed for it, and there are certain like reimbursement codes that exist. So for innovative products, if you don't fit exactly into one of those reimbursement codes, it's actually kind of tricky to find a way to get paid for what you do. Particularly also in our case, it's sometimes challenging to kind of align all the stakeholders. We have a value proposition that is more based on what is called value-based care. So basically, if you use our device, then you will have less hospital readmissions. But for instance, that to a certain degree works against the private hospitals because, I mean, it's maybe a little bit blunt to put it this way, but if they have less hospital readmissions, they obviously can charge less to the healthcare insurers, so they are billing less amount of money. So most of the market works in that way, and sometimes
but the U.S. is changing as adopting value-based care more than they were before, right? So this idea of, if you can intervene early and change sort of the cost structure of the overall care, there's benefits to that, right? So obviously, it's not fully implemented, but it's definitely, hopefully, a direction that the U.S. is going in.
Absolutely. I mean, the US is going on that direction, but it's going slow. So just to give you an example.
We might have to edit that, but okay, yeah.
It's true, though. I mean, today, I think that 90% of the US market is on a fee-for-service scheme, and only 10% of the market is value-based. So obviously, if you have a value-based value proposition, then the size of the market, or I guess the pie of the market that you can access is much smaller. So as a startup, you always have to have almost like both your value-based pitch, which is, I agree with you, the future and obviously what the patients care about, but also you have to have your fee-for-service pitch. And that's very important in order to convince investors and to actually demonstrate that you can access revenue like earlier. So that's very challenging in the US to navigate all of that process. In Europe, since the healthcare systems are more public, those incentives are more aligned. Obviously, it's more in the interest of the healthcare systems to spend less money. So that's good for us. On the contrary, however, since these are like kind of like really huge healthcare systems, the contracting process is really, the leading time to sign a contract with the national healthcare system is very long. So that takes like, the sales cycle is very long. So that would be the con. So I guess that every geography has their own pros and cons is the message that I would like to say, I guess.
And, so obviously you are, having dialogue with investors, what are the U.S. investors like relative to, I don't even know if you're speaking to European investors, but have you spoken to European investors, and what is the different experience between a U.S. investor versus a potential European investor?
Yeah, we have spoken to both, and actually we have both kind of investors on our cap table. Our seed round was led by investor group in the US called Butterworth Capital. So they invest in early stage startups that have a very strong scientific component. We had the participation of VC group in Barcelona, actually, that is called Nina Capital, and that invests particularly on digital health startups with European entrepreneurs. I guess that there is a, generally speaking, difference. I think that in the US, investors are willing to take more risk than in Europe, and they are willing to go with early stage startups that, I mean, oftentimes they invest when there is no revenue yet. I think that in Europe is more difficult. It's not impossible, but typically investors in Europe want already to see traction, and they already want to see that you are making sales, and they want to get in. This is my personal impression. They want to get in the game once you are much farther along the road. So for an early stage startup, I think it's a little bit more difficult to raise capital in Europe from our experience. But as I said, I'm speaking broadly, and obviously I think that there are cases.
No, that's why I asked. Yeah. No, that's definitely why I asked. And is, healthcare and digital health, I mean, there's a pretty good buzz these days. If you could, and you have some remote monitoring, so you can throw a little bit of telehealth in there, right? So these are all hot spots. How does that help you?
Well, as I was saying, to a certain degree, the COVID pandemic, I mean, to a certain degree, it's been an impediment to us because we haven't been able to start our clinical studies and test our device on patients, because all of that has been put to a pause. But to a certain degree, it's accelerating the trends of moving all the healthcare to the remote monitoring, the home setting, and putting much more emphasis on telehealth. So all of those trends kind of work to our advantage. I think there has been an increased highlight on the importance of keeping patients away from the hospital, especially if they may be compromised. So that's exactly kind of the value proposition that we were offering. And there have been, in the US, for instance, a push to allow these reimbursement codes to apply for procedures that are performed at home, that sometimes before they would only apply if the procedure was performed in the hospital. So I think that there is an increased chance that we can use those reimbursement codes and be able to provide our service in a remote setting. And those trends are being accelerated right now.
And so where are you as far as, product development, and, what are the next steps for you?
Yeah, so in terms of product development, we have a working prototype that, as I was saying, we tested on 40 patients and we demonstrated proof of principle in humans. So that was a huge milestone for the company. That was actually the milestone that allowed us to raise our seed round of financing and spin out from MIT. And moving forward, our next steps now are focused on building an industrialized version of that prototype, a product that we can put on the hands of naive users and they can use reliably reliably. So that's our first milestone. And then once we have that industrialized product, complete the pivotal clinical trials for the FDA.
And so what timelines are we looking at?
So we are looking at, I guess, completing our product development before the end of this year and starting our clinical trials so that by the end of 2021, we have the data to perform our FDA submission and start selling.
And will you raise money in the midst of that, or you have enough to get through that period?
Right. So right now, I mean, we raised our round before setting out to perform these milestones, and recently got this additional support from NIH and the SBIR program. So with that, currently we have enough resources to focus on these milestones, and we are planning to raise our Series A once we complete these milestones, and that Series A will be focused on how to actually start selling and get the product out in the market.
And how long have you guys been working on this?
We've been working on this for a fair amount of time. We started back at MIT in 2014, so it's been like 5 or 6 years. this was a research project before it was a startup, and we started from scratch. It took us a little while to figure out the science behind the technology. As I was saying, this is something that is being done for the first time. Nobody ever had done white blood cell measurements through the skin and without drawing blood. So it was a research project for 4 years at MIT, and we spun out a couple of years ago in 2018.
And, in hindsight, what would you have done differently if what did you learn along the way? If any, hopefully something, but,
I guess many things. I mean, for instance, I think that today I could do the way we raise our round. I would do it differently, because we raised our round while we were like finishing on our clinical studies and completing our prototype and working on our regulatory strategy. So we were doing a lot of different activities at the same time. Yeah. And I think that it's important to actually, I think I would do it differently today. I think I would do a focus effort on, complete your regulatory strategy, your prototype, your clinical studies, get the milestones to a point that you think is like the best way possible so that you can go and fundraise. But then when you fundraise, I think it should be a focus effort of like 3 or 4 or 6 months that you only, that's like your only, the only activity that you
It's a job, right? Fundraising is a job.
A full-time job, definitely.
Yep.
Seeing that I guess something that we, in hindsight, we would make differently is that we were kind of juggling that job with 5 other jobs. So that was very challenging. And I think it would be important to do a more like focus effort if I were to do it again. So that's, for instance, one learning. I guess that another one is that, we were working with, for our FDA strategy, we were working with regulatory consultants that help us. They had a lot of experience with prior submissions, but they had experience maybe with products that were a little bit different to our product. Mm-hmm. And then at some point in our FDA discussions, we got to very technical questions, because, the FDA, they are scientists, and you get to a very detailed level of discussions. And I think that, for instance, our consultants lack expertise on that particular.
So they weren't able to prepare you for that.
Yeah, that's correct. I think that one piece of advice, or I guess one thing that we would do different, is that we, from the beginning, we would hire consultants that have expertise, particularly in the exact same product that we have, and that they have done that process a lot of times before, because there is, as they say, the devil is in the details at the end of the day, and it's important that they know very well your space and your product.
But you're innovating, right? So hopefully there's not a lot of products and people out there that have already done this, and that's sort of the catch-22, right?
That's correct. And I think that, our regulatory consultants, they did a very good job, but at the end of the day, it's true that it got like so specific that, it's true that to a certain degree, there are other products that are innovative that have gone through the FDA. The FDA has a particular designation for that is called de novo. If that's your case, then you want to look for somebody who has a lot of experience doing de novo submissions, particularly, just to give one example.
And I know that your initial intent is to use this product for people who are undergoing chemotherapy, but obviously you could expand beyond that, right? As far as this technology can be used for other types of diagnostics. Am I correct?
That is correct. We focus on cancer patients undergoing chemotherapy because, as I was saying before, this is a huge problem for this population. Sure. There are other populations that are also immunocompromised and that they could benefit from increased access to white blood cell monitoring. There are other drugs that produce immunosuppression apart from chemotherapy drugs. There are drugs for psoriasis and schizophrenia and Parkinson's and other conditions that also produce immunosuppression or low white blood cells. Organ transplants are other population that are at risk of having low white blood cells in certain cases. There are patients that have what is called, they have chronic disease where they lack neutrophils, which is the most common type of white blood cell. That's a very rare disease, so there are not a lot of patients with that condition. But that's another population that could really benefit from this, because that population currently they need to get like weekly or bi-weekly blood draws just to make sure that they are not gonna get into trouble. So that's a population that could immensely benefit from that, even though the numbers are low. So these are just a few examples, and same as we have applications for patients, there are other applications for drug development and pharma companies. Many of them during the process of developing drugs, they go through what is called phase 1 trials, where they need to determine, I guess, the safe dose for humans, and they need to perform like white blood cell measurements for that. So this could be a tool to aid in drug discovery.
And what, what does the competitive landscape look like? Who's addressing this currently? And then how do you differentiate from some of the other solutions that already exist in the marketplace?
Yeah, I mean, there are a few competitors that are, there are a few startups that are developing products where you can measure your white blood cells by pricking your finger. So to be akin to the diabetics, you prick your finger.
A little blood draw, yeah.
It still requires a blood draw, and there are some papers and public studies that have demonstrated that when patients do that unsupervised, they may introduce interstitial fluid into the sample, and that may mess up with the reliability of the test.
Sure.
That's for instance one differentiator, and obviously the fact that we are completely non-invasive. But these are a few of the competitors.
And so, if this all goes the way that you want this to go, do you keep adding more products? Do you add more technology and innovate? Where would you like this to go?
Yeah, so as I was saying, we see this as our first minimum viable product, and after that we have a technology development roadmap to actually expand our capabilities. This first minimum viable product, as I was saying, only gives a binary determination of whether patients are in trouble or not. But we plan to expand beyond that and be able to provide more quantitative measurements and actually be able to differentiate different levels or move towards like giving a number the same way that current blood draws do. And as we increase our technical capabilities, that opens up new use cases and new applications for other conditions. And I guess that we also want to go beyond that, and we have a few ideas on how to measure other blood parameters beyond white blood cells. So we could be measuring red blood cells and platelets and hemoglobin levels. And we see this as a platform technology that we could have several products in the pipeline for our portfolio, but we are starting with this one.
So based on where you're hoping to go, who do you want to talk to in the next 6 months?
In the next 6 months,
12 months. We'll give you 12 months. I know you're busy, but like, who are the people that you want to be talking to? What are the introductions that you want?
Yeah, so we wanna be talking to healthcare insurance companies. As I was saying, those are prospective customers for us, so we want to understand what they are looking for and what their needs are. We did a push in the past, as I was saying, with those 100 interviews, but we want to continue developing those relationships. So insurance companies is one stakeholder. Private cancer clinics is another one. And I guess the third one would be pharma companies that are developing drugs that can produce immunosuppression. We have this, I guess, hypothesis that this could be a tool to help in their drug discovery process, or even once the drug is out in the market as a companion diagnostic. So we would love to, interact with these stakeholders and learn more about their needs. And these are a few of the people that we would love to be talking to in the next 6 months.
I mean, it's really interesting because, those players or those groups that you've talk about have different sort of objectives, right? So like when you talk about the payer, they are focused on value-based care because, their objective is looking at, can we intervene? Can we reduce, overall costs, which is potentially a different objective than what the providers are looking at, which is a different objective than what the farmers are looking at. So, you are selling the same product to three different people, but it's from 3 different value propositions, right?
That's potentially. And I guess that in the company we started with one value proposition that was more focused, as I was saying, on the value-based and the insurers, but with time we have been identifying different customer profiles. This is something that we do with the support of NIH, and we are kind of honing our value propositions for different stakeholders. We think that our technology, again, can provide value for different customers, and obviously there is a different value proposition for each of them. So that's something that we are also developing through the next months. You were asking what our next steps are, and I guess I spoke about the scientific and the technology and the product and the clinical milestones. But I forgot to mention, and this is very important, that in parallel to that, we have a track of obviously market discovery and pre-marketing activities. We cannot sell our product yet until we have FDA, but we want to interact with these customers, understand what the sales process is, so that we are ready to hit the road running once we get the FDA approval.
Cool. Well, I very much appreciate you taking some time to speak with us and sharing what's going on at Leuko. So again, thank you very much. And please keep us in, send us some updates, and we'll love to keep telling our readers and listeners about what's going on. Again, thank you very much, and we welcome you back at any time.
All right. Yeah, thank you, Mike, and thank you for giving us this opportunity as well.
Okay, thanks.